Yorkshire, England, April 1945. Frost still clung to the hedgerows in the early morning light as Thomas Hartwell surveyed his fields from the kitchen window. At 52, his weathered hands told the story of decades working this land, but the lines around his eyes spoke of deeper sorrows. The telegram announcing his son William's death at Normandy had arrived 8 months ago, yet the pain remained as sharp as winter wind. Britain held nearly 180,000 German prisoners of war by this time, scattered across camps throughout the countryside. The government's agricultural committee had determined that these men, once enemies, would now serve as laborers to fill the void left by British farmers who had traded plows for rifles. Thomas had resisted the program initially, but necessity forced his hand. His farm of 200 acres couldn't survive another season, worked by him alone. Mary Hartwell, 17 and possessed of her late mother's gentle spirit, prepared breakfast in the kitchen behind him. She had grown up quickly since her mother's death 3 years prior, managing the household while her father struggled with grief and the demands of wartime farming. The rationing had made even simple meals a challenge, but Mary had learned to stretch their allowances with creativity born of necessity. The sound of a military truck grinding up the lane broke the morning silence. Thomas straightened his shoulders, steeling himself for what was to come. Through the window, he watched as 3 men in work clothes climbed down from the vehicle, their movements careful and uncertain. A British officer with a clipboard approached the farmhouse door. Klaus Miller stepped onto Yorkshire soil with the measured gait of a man who had learned to expect nothing good from sudden changes. At 34, the former literature professor from Hamburg carried himself with quiet dignity despite the circumstances that had brought him here. Captured during the Falaise pocket collapse, he had spent months in various camps before this assignment. His hands, once soft from years of handling books, had grown calloused from camp labor. Heinrich Bauer, barely 23, looked around the farm with eyes that remembered his family's land in Bavaria. The youngest son of a farming family, he had been drafted into the Wehrmacht at 19 and captured during the Battle of the Bulge. His boyish face bore the premature lines of someone who had seen too much, but his familiarity with farm work was evident in how he assessed the livestock and equipment. Wilhelm Schneider stood apart from the others, his 41 years weighing heavily on shoulders that had carried a rifle in 2 world wars. A career soldier who had survived the trenches of the Somme and the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, he possessed the stoic demeanor of a man who had learned to endure whatever fate delivered. His gray eyes missed nothing as he evaluated their new surroundings. The British officer, Lieutenant Morrison, knocked briskly on the farmhouse door. Thomas opened it with reluctance written across his features. The exchange was brief and formal. Papers were signed, basic rules explained, and responsibilities outlined. The prisoners would work 6 days a week, receive standard rations, and be housed in the converted barn loft. Any attempt to escape would result in immediate return to a high-security camp. Mary watched from the kitchen doorway as her father led the 3 Germans toward the barn. She noticed how thin they were, how carefully they moved, as if expecting harsh treatment at any moment. Her heart, already tender from loss, stirred with unexpected sympathy. These men looked more like refugees than the fearsome enemy soldiers she had imagined. The first days passed in tense silence. Communication relied on gestures, broken English phrases, and Klaus's rudimentary knowledge of the language gained from his university studies. Thomas assigned tasks with curt efficiency, mucking stables, mending fences, preparing fields for spring planting. The prisoners worked with methodical determination, understanding that their treatment depended on their usefulness. Klaus found unexpected solace in the rhythm of physical labor. After years of intellectual pursuits, the simple act of repairing a gate or stacking hay bales provided a meditative quality that helped quiet his anxious thoughts about his wife and daughter in Hamburg. The last letter he had received months ago spoke of increasing bombing raids and food shortages. He had no way of knowing if they were even alive. Heinrich's natural affinity for animals became apparent immediately. The farm's dairy cows, initially skittish around the strangers, soon responded to his gentle touch and patient manner. He had learned these skills as a boy on his family's farm, before the war swept him away from the life he had expected to live. Working with the livestock brought back memories of simpler times, when his greatest concern was whether the weather would cooperate with the harvest. Wilhelm approached each task with military precision, applying the organizational skills that had kept him alive through 2 wars. He assessed the farm's efficiency with a strategic eye. noting improvements that could be made to workflows and equipment maintenance. His suggestions, communicated through careful demonstration rather than words, began to earn Thomas's grudging respect. The village of Little Thornfield had watched the arrival of German prisoners with mixed emotions. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the local shop, initially refused to serve them when Thomas brought them to purchase supplies. Her son had died at El Alamein, and the sight of German uniforms, even on prisoners, reopened wounds she thought had healed. However, when Heinrich quietly helped her carry heavy sacks of flour without being asked, her hostility began to soften. Dr. Whitmore, the village physician, was called to examine Wilhelm's persistent cough, a legacy of gas exposure from the previous war. As he listened to the German's chest, he found himself engaged in a halting conversation about medicinal herbs common to both England and Germany. The doctor's professional instincts overcame his political prejudices, and he provided treatment with the same care he would show any patient. The local pub, the King's Arms, became a testing ground for changing attitudes. Initially, the presence of German prisoners in the village sparked heated discussions among the regulars. Some demanded they be sent away, while others argued for the practical necessity of their labor. Gradually, as stories spread of their hard work and respectful behavior, the tone began to shift. Spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal, and the farm responded to the combined efforts of its workers. Klaus's education proved valuable in managing accounts and correspondence, skills that Thomas had always struggled with. Heinrich's expertise with machinery kept the aging equipment running smoothly, while Wilhelm's knowledge of crop rotation and soil management improved yields beyond what Thomas had achieved in years. Mary began teaching the prisoners basic English during their evening meal breaks. She started with simple words related to farm work, but gradually expanded to more complex concepts. In return, Klaus shared German phrases, and when she expressed interest, recited poetry from memory. These exchanges, conducted in the barn loft by lamplight, became a bridge between two cultures at war. The news from Europe grew increasingly dire for Germany as April progressed. Radio broadcasts spoke of Allied forces crossing the Rhine, of cities falling one by one, of a Reich collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. The prisoners listened to these reports with complex emotions, relief that the killing might soon end, but anxiety about what they would find when they returned home. Klaus confided in Mary about his family during one of their English lessons. His wife, Anna, was a nurse in Hamburg. His daughter, Greta, would be 15 now, if she had survived the bombing raids that had devastated the city. The uncertainty gnawed at him, made worse by the knowledge that even if they were alive, they might not recognize the man he had become. Heinrich spoke of his parents' farm in Bavaria, wondering if it still existed or if it had been destroyed in the fighting. His two brothers had also been conscripted, and he had no word of their fate. The farm had been in his family for 4 generations, and the thought that it might be lost forever filled him with despair that he struggled to hide. Wilhelm, ever the stoic soldier, revealed little about his personal losses. Only gradually did Mary learn that he had lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front, that his wife had died during a bombing raid on Munich. His survival through 2 wars seemed almost cruel when weighed against these losses, and she began to understand the profound sadness that lay beneath his disciplined exterior. Thomas found himself observing these conversations with growing discomfort. The humanity of his prisoners challenged the simple narrative of good versus evil that had sustained him through years of war and personal loss. When he heard Klaus speak of his daughter with the same tender concern he had felt for William, the walls he had built around his heart began to show cracks. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday in late April. Thomas was struggling to repair a section of fence damaged by a fallen tree when Klaus approached hesitantly. Without words, the German began helping, his movements careful and respectful. Together they worked in the drizzle, the shared goal creating a moment of understanding that transcended language and nationality. That evening, as Thomas sat by the fire reading William's last letter for the 100th time, Mary broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. The approaching end of the war, she argued, called for gestures of reconciliation rather than continued hostility. These men had worked hard, shown respect, and demonstrated their humanity. Perhaps it was time to acknowledge theirs in return. The idea that formed in Mary's mind was both simple and revolutionary. Sunday dinner had always been sacred in the Hartwell household. a tradition maintained even through the darkest days of rationing and loss. What if they invited the prisoners to join them? What if they shared not just their table, but their most cherished family ritual? Thomas's initial reaction was swift and negative. These men were still the enemy, regardless of their behavior. William had died fighting their countrymen, and to invite them to the family table felt like a betrayal of his son's sacrifice. But Mary persisted with gentle logic, pointing out that hatred had already cost them too much, that perhaps healing required acts of radical kindness. The decision, when it finally came, surprised Thomas himself. Perhaps it was exhaustion from carrying anger for so long, or maybe it was the memory of his wife's voice reminding him of Christian charity. On Saturday evening, as the prisoners prepared for another solitary meal in the barn, Thomas approached them with an invitation that would change everything. The words came awkwardly, translated through Klaus's limited English and accompanied by gestures. Tomorrow, Sunday, they were invited to join the family for dinner. Not as prisoners or laborers, but as guests at the Hartwell table. The three Germans received this news with stunned silence, uncertain whether they had understood correctly. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of spring finally fulfilled. Mary rose early to begin preparations for what she knew would be an extraordinary meal. Despite wartime rationing, she had saved ingredients for weeks. A precious joint of beef, flour for Yorkshire pudding, vegetables from their own garden, and even a small portion of sugar for dessert. The prisoners spent the morning in careful preparation, washing thoroughly and donning their cleanest clothes. They understood the significance of the invitation, the risk Thomas was taking in extending such hospitality to enemy soldiers. The weight of this gesture pressed upon them as they worked through their regular morning chores with unusual quiet. Thomas found himself equally nervous, second-guessing his decision throughout the morning. What would the neighbors think? What would William think? But Mary's excitement and determination carried him forward, and by noon, the dining room was set with the family's best china, carefully preserved through years of hardship. The meal itself was a masterpiece of wartime ingenuity. The beef, though smaller than peacetime portions, was perfectly roasted and accompanied by crispy Yorkshire pudding that rose like golden clouds. Vegetables from the garden provided color and nutrition, while the gravy, made rich with careful seasoning, promised to tie everything together in the traditional British manner. When the moment came to call the prisoners to dinner, Thomas found his voice catching slightly. The formality of the invitation, delivered in the doorway of the barn, marked a crossing point from which there could be no return. Klaus, Heinrich, and Wilhelm followed him to the farmhouse with the careful steps of men entering sacred ground. The dining room, with its polished table and carefully arranged place settings, represented everything they had lost and feared they might never see again. The simple act of being invited to sit at a family table, to be treated as guests rather than captives, overwhelmed their carefully maintained composure. Thomas took his place at the head of the table, with Mary to his right and the three Germans arranged along the sides. The silence stretched for a moment as everyone grappled with the enormity of what was happening. Then Thomas began carving the roast, the familiar ritual providing a framework for the unprecedented situation. As plates were filled and passed around the table, conversation began hesitantly. Mary's German phrases, learned during their evening lessons, helped bridge the language gap, while Klaus's improving English allowed for more complex exchanges. The food, simple but abundant by wartime standards, represented a feast to men who had grown accustomed to meager rations. The moment that would be remembered by all present came when Thomas reached for the gravy boat, a delicate piece of china that had belonged to his grandmother. Without hesitation, he passed it to Klaus, saying simply, "Please, help yourself." The gesture, so natural in peacetime but revolutionary in the context of war, broke something fundamental in the German professor. Klaus took the gravy boat with trembling hands, his vision blurring as tears began to flow. The simple act of being offered a place at the table, of being treated with dignity and respect, shattered the emotional barriers he had built to survive captivity. Heinrich and Wilhelm, witnessing their companion's breakdown, found their own carefully controlled emotions overwhelming them. The tears were not just for the kindness shown, but for everything they had lost and feared they would never find again. For Klaus, it was the memory of Sunday dinners with his family in Hamburg, the uncertainty of whether he would ever share such moments again. For Heinrich, it was the echo of his mother's voice calling him to the table on his family's Bavarian farm. For Wilhelm, it was the recognition that humanity could survive even the worst that war could inflict. Thomas, witnessing the emotional collapse of these men he had thought of as enemies, felt his own defenses crumbling. The tears of gratitude for such a simple gesture revealed the depth of suffering that war had inflicted on all sides. In that moment, he saw not German soldiers, but fathers, sons, and brothers, whose pain mirrored his own. Mary, her own eyes bright with tears, reached across the table to place a comforting hand on Klaus's arm. "You're welcome here," she said softly, her words carrying a weight far beyond their simple meaning. The phrase became a benediction, a declaration that in this house, at this table, the war had ended. The conversation that followed was unlike anything any of them had experienced. Barriers of language, nationality, and ideology dissolved as they shared stories of loss, hope, and the simple desire to return to peaceful lives. Klaus spoke of his wife's work as a nurse, of his daughter's love for music, of the books he hoped to teach again someday. Heinrich described his family's farm, the changing seasons in Bavaria, the simple pleasures of working with animals and growing things. Wilhelm, his usual reserve softened by the wine Thomas had brought from his dwindling cellar, spoke of his sons, of the senseless waste of war, of his hope that future generations might find better ways to resolve their differences. Thomas found himself sharing memories of William, not the idealized hero of his grief, but the real boy who had loved cricket and complained about farm chores. The pain of loss remained, but sharing it with others who understood such grief somehow made it more bearable. The recognition that these men had lost as much as he had, perhaps more, began to heal wounds he had thought would never close. As the afternoon wore on, the formal boundaries of the meal dissolved into something approaching friendship. Laughter emerged, tentative at first but growing in confidence as shared humanity overcame historical enmity. Stories were exchanged, photographs passed around, and plans discussed for the uncertain future that awaited them all. The impact of that Sunday dinner extended far beyond the Hartwell farmhouse. Word of Thomas's gesture spread through the village, initially causing shock and disapproval among some residents. Mrs. Patterson confronted him at the shop, demanding to know how he could betray his son's memory by fraternizing with the enemy. But Thomas's quiet explanation of what he had witnessed, the genuine humanity he had discovered, gradually began to change minds. Dr. Whitmore, when he heard the story, nodded with professional understanding. He had seen enough of war's casualties to recognize that healing required more than medical treatment. The wounds inflicted by hatred and fear needed different medicine, and sometimes that medicine came in the form of unexpected kindness. Other farmers in the area, many of whom employed German prisoners, began to reconsider their own treatment of these men. The practical benefits of better relations became apparent as prisoners who felt respected worked harder and caused fewer problems. What had begun as Thomas's personal gesture of reconciliation became a model for others to follow. The prisoners themselves were transformed by the experience. Letters they wrote home, carefully censored by British authorities, spoke of unexpected kindness and dignity in captivity. These accounts, when they reached Germany, provided a counter-narrative to the propaganda that had painted all enemies as monsters. The seeds of post-war reconciliation were being planted in the most unlikely soil. Klaus began keeping a journal, documenting not just the events of each day but his evolving understanding of the people who had become his captors, and increasingly, his friends. His academic training helped him recognize the historical significance of what was happening, the way individual acts of kindness could reshape relationships between nations. Heinrich wrote to his parents, describing the English countryside and the farming techniques he was learning. His letters, when they finally reached Bavaria months later, would help his family understand that their son had found not just survival, but dignity in captivity. The knowledge that he was treated well eased their suffering and gave them hope for his eventual return. Wilhelm, despite his natural reserve, found himself opening up to Thomas during their work together. The two veterans, separated by nationality but united by their understanding of war's true cost, developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience. Their conversations, conducted in broken English supplemented by gestures, covered everything from farming techniques to the hope for lasting peace. The transformation was not without its challenges. Some villagers remained hostile, viewing any kindness toward German prisoners as treason. Anonymous letters appeared criticizing Thomas for his collaboration with the enemy. But the support of friends like Dr. Whitmore and the gradual evidence of positive change in the prisoner's behavior slowly won over even the most skeptical observers. As spring turned toward summer, the farm prospered under the combined efforts of its diverse workforce. The fields, better managed than they had been in years, promised an abundant harvest. The livestock thrived under Heinrich's expert care, while Klaus's organizational skills helped Thomas navigate the complex bureaucracy of wartime agriculture. The Sunday dinners became a regular tradition, each one building upon the foundation of trust and friendship established by that first emotional gathering. Mary's cooking improved as she learned to adapt German recipes to British ingredients, creating fusion dishes that delighted everyone at the table. The conversations grew more sophisticated as language barriers continued to fall. News of Germany's surrender reached the farm on May 8, 1945. The reaction was complex and subdued. While the end of fighting brought relief, it also raised questions about the future. What would happen to the prisoners? When would they be repatriated? What would they find when they returned to a defeated and occupied homeland? Thomas found himself conflicted about the prospect of losing his workers, who had become more than laborers. The thought of the farm returning to its previous isolation, of losing the friendship and understanding that had developed, filled him with unexpected sadness. The war's end, which should have brought unqualified joy, instead brought uncertainty and the prospect of new losses. The prisoners faced their own complex emotions. Joy at the end of killing was tempered by anxiety about their family's fate and their own uncertain future. Klaus worried about finding his wife and daughter in the ruins of Hamburg. Heinrich wondered if his family's farm still existed. Wilhelm, with no family left to return to, faced the prospect of starting over in a destroyed country. The process of repatriation began slowly, with bureaucratic delays and logistical challenges. The prisoners remained at the farm through the summer of 1945, continuing their work while awaiting transport home. This extended period allowed relationships to deepen further and provided time for proper farewells. During these final months, the impact of their experience became clear. Klaus had not only learned English but had begun translating German poetry for Mary, sharing his culture while absorbing hers. Heinrich had taught Thomas new farming techniques that would improve the land's productivity for years to come. Wilhelm had helped repair and improve equipment with innovations born of necessity and ingenuity. The village, too, had been changed by their presence. The initial hostility had given way to acceptance and, in some cases, genuine friendship. When Heinrich fell ill with pneumonia in late summer, the community rallied to support his recovery, with villagers bringing food and medicine. The transformation from enemies to neighbors was complete. As autumn approached and repatriation orders finally arrived, the emotional weight of impending separation settled over the farm. The relationships forged in the crucible of war had become genuine friendships, and the prospect of permanent separation was painful for everyone involved. The final Sunday dinner was both celebration and wake, honoring what had been accomplished while mourning what would be lost. Thomas presented each prisoner with a small gift. Klaus received a volume of English poetry, Heinrich a set of farming tools, and Wilhelm a photograph of the farm they had helped to restore. In return, the Germans offered what they could. Klaus had written out German poems in careful script, Heinrich had carved wooden animals from memory of his homeland, and Wilhelm had crafted a small wooden box with intricate joinery. The farewells, when they came, were emotional and profound. Klaus embraced Thomas and Mary, promising to write when he could. Heinrich wept openly as he said goodbye to the animals he had tended with such care. Wilhelm, true to his stoic nature, simply shook hands firmly and nodded his thanks, but his eyes revealed the depth of his feeling. As the military transport drove away, carrying the 3 Germans toward an uncertain future, Thomas and Mary stood in the farmyard they had all worked to improve. The silence felt heavy after months of voices, laughter, and shared purpose. The war was over, but something precious had been lost in the victory. Letters began arriving within months, carefully written and eagerly anticipated. Klaus had found his family alive but homeless in Hamburg's ruins. He was working to rebuild the university and had spoken to colleagues about his experiences in England. Heinrich had returned to find his parents' farm damaged but salvageable, and he was applying techniques learned in Yorkshire to restore the land. Wilhelm had settled in a small Bavarian town, working as a carpenter and helping other veterans adjust to peacetime. The correspondence continued for years, bridging the gap between former enemies and maintaining friendships forged in the most unlikely circumstances. Klaus eventually visited England in the 1950s, bringing his wife and daughter to meet the family who had shown him such kindness. Heinrich sent photographs of his rebuilt farm and invited Thomas to visit Bavaria. Wilhelm's letters, though less frequent, carried news of Germany's gradual recovery and his own quiet contentment. The impact of that first Sunday dinner extended far beyond the individuals involved. Thomas became an advocate for reconciliation, speaking to local groups about his experiences and encouraging others to see beyond the divisions of war. Mary, inspired by her friendships with the German prisoners, pursued studies in languages and international relations, eventually working for organizations dedicated to promoting peace. The story spread through various channels, becoming part of the larger narrative of post-war reconciliation. Historians would later recognize such personal connections as crucial to the rebuilding of relationships between former enemies. The Marshall Plan and other official programs provided the framework for recovery, but it was individual acts of kindness and understanding that gave those efforts their human dimension. Dr. Whitmore documented the psychological benefits he observed in both the prisoners and the local community, contributing to academic understanding of how reconciliation could be fostered at the grassroots level. His papers, published in medical journals, helped inform policies for treating former enemies with dignity and respect. The farm itself became a symbol of transformation. Visitors would come to hear Thomas tell his story, to understand how hatred could be overcome through simple human decency. The dining room where that first momentous meal had been shared became a shrine to the possibility of peace, with the gravy boat displayed as a reminder of how small gestures could change the world. As the years passed and the participants aged, the story took on legendary qualities. But for those who had lived it, the memory remained vivid and transformative. Thomas would often say that the war had taken his son, but given him 3 new friends, a trait he would never have chosen, but one that taught him the true meaning of victory. The lesson of that Sunday roast endured long after the participants had passed away. In a world still struggling with division and hatred, their example offered hope that understanding could triumph over prejudice, that humanity could survive even the worst conflicts, and that sometimes the greatest victories were won not on battlefields but around dinner tables, where former enemies could become friends over a simple meal and a shared gravy boat. If this story of unexpected humanity in the darkest of times moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more untold stories from history that remind us of our shared humanity. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these powerful, forgotten moments to light. If you're already part of our community, a like would mean the world to us and helps others discover these incredible true stories. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Do you know of similar stories of reconciliation during wartime? Have you experienced moments where simple kindness transcended deep divisions? These stories matter because they show us that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion can still flourish. By sharing, liking, and commenting, you're helping preserve these lessons for future generations who need to remember that our capacity for understanding each other is stronger than our capacity for hatred. Thank you for being part of this journey through history's most profound human moments. Your engagement keeps these vital stories alive. Subscribe, like, comment, share, because every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change the world.